Great Laura was on the road again, but this time not just along the familiar highways and dusty farm lanes of Nebraska, but into a storm of uncertainty that would test everything she believed about strength, leadership, and survival, because in a single, brutal moment a horrific accident brought the entire Laura family farm's operation to a standstill and threatened to erase 5 generations of hard work, tradition, and trust, forcing Laura Wilson, once celebrated as a rising symbol of the new American farmer, to face the most painful choice of her life: protect her family or fight to save the business that defined her identity and purpose. And in that moment the world began to see what true strength really looks like, because in March 2024 at the Laura Family Farms Equipment Repair Facility in Hamilton County, Nebraska, Cale Carlson, the founder of the modern Carlson farm system and the technical backbone of the entire operation, was conducting a routine inspection of a mechanized harvesting system when a devastating accident involving a combine harvester left him with life-altering injuries, long-term disability, and months of painful rehabilitation at the Grand Island Medical Center, instantly removing the man who had been the operational heart of a 2,000-acre agricultural enterprise built on corn, soybeans, cattle, poultry, and precision timing. And with spring planting already underway, his sudden absence created a vacuum that could not be filled overnight. Because Cale had not only run machinery but carried institutional memory, leadership authority, and technical decision-making that guided every hour of the workday, and now Laura and her husband Grant were forced to step into full production control while still emotionally processing the trauma of nearly losing the man who built the farm, and the impact was immediate as equipment schedules collapsed, training routines fell apart, and yield projections dropped sharply while partners and suppliers waited anxiously for answers, and by May 2024 Laura reported to private investors that early season output was already down over 18% compared to the same period the year before, driven by technical disruption, staffing shifts, and delays in soil preparation, and cooperative agreements for machinery maintenance and deferred distribution were frozen or renegotiated, placing additional strain on cash flow and morale. And while the farm went quiet publicly, industry forums buzzed with speculation about whether one of the Midwest's most visible family farms could survive such a sudden blow, because Laura Family Farms was not just a production unit, it had become a cultural model of how modern farming could blend tradition, technology, and public education, and the silence worried followers who had watched Laura grow from a teenage cattle manager into a national voice for digital agriculture. And when she finally addressed the crisis at the Midwest Agricultural Conference in June, her words carried both pain and resolve as she explained that the accident forced a total reassessment of how the farm was organized, operated, and protected its people, warning that agriculture still relies heavily on mechanization but lacks uniform safety training and accountability. And she made it clear that what happened to her father was not just bad luck but a systemic warning to the entire industry, and behind those public statements stood a much deeper personal story that began more than a century earlier in 1910 when her great-grandfather, a Swedish immigrant seeking stability and land, arrived in Nebraska and built the first small operation that would eventually grow into what the world now knew as Carlson Farms, expanding generation by generation from a few acres into a 2,000-acre ecosystem integrating crops, livestock, mechanized systems, and family labor. And Laura, born Laura Carlson, grew up inside that living history as the eldest of 5 children, watching her father Cale become the 4th-generation leader and the first to integrate digital tools and public education into daily farming operations, while her mother Megan Nelson Carlson managed logistics, scheduling, and the complex internal flow of a large agricultural business. And from childhood Laura was taught that farming was not just about land but about discipline, responsibility, and stewardship, and at 13 she was given her own cattle herd to manage independently, keeping financial records, reporting profits and losses, and learning decision-making the hard way, and that hands-on education shaped her leadership style long before she ever spoke into a camera or addressed a conference. And after graduating from Nebraska Christian schools, she studied business administration at Southeast Community College, finishing in 2019 before enrolling at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. only to pause her academic path in 2020 as the family began transferring operational responsibility to the next generation. And that year Laura made the bold choice to focus fully on expanding her farm management role and launching what would become her digital agriculture brand, Laura Farms, a platform dedicated to corn and soybean production, machinery operation, soil management, and the everyday realities of running a modern farm. And within 12 months her straightforward, practical content attracted hundreds of thousands of followers from Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Ohio, and South Dakota, with viewers drawn to her honesty, clarity, and refusal to glamorize the work. And by the end of 2023 her combined platforms had nearly 1 billion views, with strong engagement from people aged 25 to 44 who actually owned or managed farms, making her not just a content creator but a trusted peer voice in agriculture. And when the accident happened, that digital engine went silent, not because Laura lost her passion but because survival took priority. And in those early weeks the family's strength came from deep community roots as neighbors shared equipment, local groups helped maintain seasonal labor, and religious organizations offered emotional and financial support while Laura's husband Grant, an agricultural engineer, took over mechanized operations and quality control. Her siblings returned from school and out-of-state jobs to help keep the property running, and her mother Megan coordinated medical care, insurance, legal paperwork, and farm documentation with relentless focus, and that unity allowed the farm to stay alive long enough to plan its rebirth. And as the shock of the accident slowly gave way to action, Laura and her family realized that surviving was not enough. They had to rebuild in a way that would honor the past while protecting the future, and that meant changing almost everything about how Laura family farms operated, because the old system had depended too heavily on one man's knowledge and strength. And when Cale Carlson was removed from daily work, the weaknesses of that structure were exposed, so Laura and Grant began by separating management, technical, and communication roles, hiring independent mechanical contractors instead of relying on family labor for dangerous equipment maintenance, and bringing in outside advisors to review every procedure from soil preparation to grain storage to machine traffic flow. And the goal was not just recovery but prevention. Because Laura knew that if this tragedy taught her anything, it was that good intentions do not replace good systems. And during the summer of 2024 the farm became a living laboratory for change as safety training sessions were held weekly, emergency drills were practiced with local responders, and every worker, family member, and seasonal hire had to pass standardized instruction before touching a machine. And Laura took personal responsibility for building a culture where asking questions and stopping unsafe work was seen as strength, not weakness. And while the fields still needed planting and livestock still needed feeding, she also reopened her communication channels carefully, explaining to her followers not just what had happened but what she was learning from it. And those updates were different from anything she had posted before, less polished, more honest, and deeply human. And people responded with overwhelming support, sharing their own stories of accidents, close calls, and silent suffering inside farm families that rarely talk about fear. And Laura realized her platform was no longer just about teaching how to grow crops. It was about teaching how to survive responsibility. And as Cale continued his slow rehabilitation at Grand Island Medical Center, the family built a new rhythm around his care, with Megan organizing a home-based recovery schedule supported by the Nebraska Farmers Fund and community health partners, and Grant balancing long days in the fields with evenings reviewing machinery data and maintenance logs, and Laura carrying the emotional weight of being both daughter and leader. And during this period her siblings, Ethan, Amanda, Adam, and David, put their own plans on hold to return to the farm, filling gaps in labor and reminding each other why their great-grandfather had come to this land in the first place. And the community surrounding Marquette and Hamilton County responded in ways that went far beyond economics as neighboring farmers shared combines and grain bins and rotating partnerships. Local officials helped secure temporary tax relief and seasonal labor grants. And churches organized fundraisers and counseling sessions, and Hamilton Catholic Church, where the family worshipped, became a spiritual anchor, reminding the Wilsons that resilience is built not just in fields but in faith. and by the end of 2024 Laura had helped launch a regional support group for farm households dealing with sudden personnel loss, trauma, or medical crisis, creating a space where families could exchange resources, advice, and emotional strength without judgment. And more than 300 people joined the network within months, proving how many were quietly carrying similar burdens. And when the calendar turned to 2025, Laura Family Farms entered a full rebirth phase, not just restoring production but redefining its identity, integrating satellite imaging, ground sensors, and automated machine diagnostics into daily operations to track soil health, pest risk, and mechanical performance in real time. And with the help of researchers from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and a regional agri-tech firm, the farm developed internal safety maps that identified high-risk zones and traffic patterns for equipment, turning data into prevention rather than reaction. And Laura also launched AgriAv Hamilton, a public education program offering seminars, field training, and technical manuals on equipment maintenance, emergency response, and first aid in agricultural environments. And within 3 months, more than 1,000 people, young farmers, high school engineering students, and maintenance crews from small operations, had participated, and what started as a response to pain became a source of regional leadership. And in May 2025, the farm published a paper titled Risk Management and Community Integration in Family-Owned Farms, sharing its crisis response model with more than 30 agricultural institutions across the Midwest. And the story of Laura Family Farms began appearing not just in local papers but in academic discussions about resilience, succession planning, and community-centered agriculture. And Laura herself was invited to join the USDA Task Force on Modernizing Small and Medium-Sized Farm Management for 2025 to 2027, focusing on non-financial risks like worker health, psychological recovery after accidents, and leadership continuity when families face sudden change. And through all of this, Laura never forgot that her original mission was still alive: to make farming understandable, honest, and human. And she returned to her platform not as a perfect success story but as a real one, showing that progress is messy, recovery is slow, and leadership is learned through failure as much as victory. And the audience who once followed her for planting tips now followed her for courage. And Laura Wilson became more than a farmer or a creator. She became a living example of what happens when adversity is met with structure, humility, and faith. And as the seasons continued to turn over the Nebraska plains, the story of Laura Wilson and Laura Family Farms became something larger than a recovery narrative. It became a blueprint for what modern rural leadership looks like in a world where tradition must walk side by side with technology and empathy. Because what Laura learned through pain was that systems matter as much as soil, and people matter more than production numbers. And by mid-2025, the fields once shaken by uncertainty were again steady, with crops rising in disciplined rows. But the atmosphere around the farm had changed forever, as safety was no longer treated as a formality but as a daily ritual, communication was no longer optional but essential, and leadership was no longer inherited by blood alone but earned through responsibility. And Laura now walked her land not just as a farmer but as a steward of culture, education, and resilience, carrying the weight of her family's past and the promise of its future at the same time. And Cale Carlson, though physically limited by the accident, remained the spiritual heart of the operation, offering wisdom, encouragement, and perspective from the sidelines, reminding Laura that strength is not measured by how much you can lift, but by how much you can endure. And Laura often said that watching her father learn to walk again taught her more about courage than any conference ever could. And with that lesson, she reshaped her leadership voice into something quieter but deeper, focused less on showing how fast you can work and more on showing why you work. And her digital platform evolved into a space for teaching values alongside techniques, where she talked openly about fear, burnout, faith, and the unseen cost of responsibility. And those conversations attracted not just farmers but families, educators, and young people searching for purpose in uncertain times. And as Laura Family Farms regained full production capacity, the business side also reflected its new identity, with diversified income streams from education, consulting, training programs, and community partnerships stabilizing revenue beyond crop yields alone, making the farm more resilient to weather, market fluctuations, and human vulnerability, and Laura's role in regional policy discussions grew as well, where she advocated for safety regulation, mental health support for rural workers, and leadership development for young farmers who often inherit land without guidance on how to lead people. And through all of this, Laura never forgot the moment everything stopped: the sound of the machine, the shock in her chest, the fear that 5 generations could disappear in a single afternoon. And she carried that memory not as trauma but as purpose, because it reminded her why she must keep building something better, not just for her family but for every farm that might face the same storm. And the Laura family farm's story became a case study not only in recovery but in reinvention, proving that even in the most traditional industries, transformation is possible when humility meets courage, and when community meets leadership, and when faith meets action. And today, when Laura stands at conferences, on stages, or in front of a camera, she does not speak as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has lived the questions, and that honesty is what makes her voice powerful. And the land that once tested her now reflects her growth in every row, every system, and every person who works beside her. And in the end, the story of Laura Wilson is not just about farming, or accidents, or technology. It is about what happens when a human being is pushed to the edge and chooses not to fall, but to rise with intention, structure, and heart. And if this journey of real land, real people, and real transformation speaks to you, then carry it forward, share it, and stay connected, because the future of agriculture, leadership, and community is not written only in soil and steel, but in courage, compassion, and the refusal to give up.